and build the next generation of leaders. On behalf of our board, staff, interns, and partners, thank you for believing in this work and for standing with us.
Well, hello everyone, and for those who I have not met, I'm Todd Delman, I'm the Executive Director of SAVE, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our Election Insider Debrief. If you like data and details, you are in for a treat. But before we talk about the elections in Miami and Miami Beach, I want to put this briefing in the broader context of SAVE's electoral work, which is evolving, and how we hope to have even more impact on future elections. Over the last 33 years, SAVE has used our endorsement process to support and help elect pro-equality candidates, and then just as importantly, hold them accountable in elected office to remain faithful to supporting our issues. This year, we've done that in a number of ways, including help stop 9 of the 11 most dangerous anti-LGBTQ bills in Tallahassee. And that didn't happen through reactive advocacy or last-minute pressure. It required early engagement, sustained coalition work, and showing up consistently before the legislative session even began. At the same time, though, we expanded our Advocacy as Pride program into a true municipal engagement strategy. We worked city by city to strengthen local protections, include municipal equality index scores, and build relationships with both voters and local officials. There are 65 municipalities across Miami-Dade and Broward, and we engaged with 20 of them in this year alone. But before someone can be of support at the dais or in the legislature, they need to get elected. So it's important to say this clearly. The elections we're discussing tonight are not separate from our advocacy work. They are part of the same power building strategy. Municipal elections are where trust is built, credibility is tested, and future legislative outcomes begin to take shape. I also want to ground our briefing in how SAVE approaches elections, because without that context, it's easy to misread the data you're about to see. When SAVE decides to engage in a particular race beyond just endorsing a candidate, we don't parachute in at the last minute. We enter early, we stay engaged, and we focus on building durable relationships rather than chasing the short-term wins. And our long-term goals to continue building a pro-equality voter base also fills our time in between elections. Whether it's community events to build our database or registering voters with our specially designed kiosks, we don't want to wait for the next election to begin executing on our strategy. So what you'll see tonight reflects that philosophy. These outcomes were not produced by one message, one week of activity, or a single tactic. They were built through early entry, disciplined strategy, and coordinated work by staff, interns, volunteers, community members, board members, and partners who stayed present through November and December. And that's the lens I want you to hold on to as we move forward tonight. This briefing is designed to walk through what the data actually shows us about voter behavior and strategy. We're intentionally not focusing only on the final margins or winners and losers. Instead, we're going to look at where influence moved, why it moved, and what it tells us about how voters are making decisions. Miami and Miami Beach will both be discussed separately, not because one electorate is better or smarter than another, but because they are structurally different electorates with different decision environments. We'll also be explicit about the role that SAVE staff and interns played in executing this work, because capacity and infrastructure matter just as much as message. And we'll close by connecting those insights directly into what SAVE's doing in our 2026 strategy and engagement opportunities. I want to begin with timing, because timing is not a footnote here. It's central to understanding these outcomes. SAVE entered the field earlier than any other progressive organization involved in these races. Canvassing, that's door to door talking to voters, began in early August, well before most campaigns launched meaningful voter contact. That early work was intentionally focused on persuasion and trust building, not turnout reminders. It allowed SAVE to test messages, voter universes, and contact strategies before the electorate became saturated. And to be clear, as a nonpartisan organization, we modeled the voters we needed to win across all parties or no party at all. The same early strategy carried through both the November elections and the December runoffs. What you see in the results is not a sudden shift in December, but the cumulative impact of early and sustained engagement. These runoffs mattered because they tested persuasion in low turnout, high attention environments. They occurred in cities that had recently leaned right at the top of the ticket and included electorates with large NPA or no party affiliation populations and shifting partisan behavior. Save made early strategic decisions about who to talk to, how to talk to them, and when to begin engagement. And those decisions were first validated by November outcomes and then reinforced in December. Taken together, these races challenge assumptions about what is and what is not winnable in Florida. They show that strategy, timing, and credibility can still move outcomes when they are aligned with how voters actually decide. Now, before we dive too deep into the data, we wanted to pause and hear briefly from someone who experienced our efforts on behalf of her campaign directly. We're honored to be joined by Vice Mayor and Commissioner Monica Matteo-Salinas, who was just sworn into office and named Vice Mayor this morning. And she'll share a few words about her race and what community engagement looked like from a candidate's perspective. So thank you so much for joining us, Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Save. Thank you guys for having me today on this call. Really, I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to have your support. I've been a commissioner for about 6 days and vice mayor for about 2 hours. So it's all very new to me. But I really can't thank you guys enough. And, I have to reiterate that the LGBTQIA vote in Miami Beach is so strong and powerful. And we really showed up and showed out and showed our voice. And there is no question what our values are in Miami Beach. And I'm just proud to be representing you all. I have your back. I'm going to fight for you. And if you need anything from me, open door. I'll give you my cell phone number. I am a very proud ally, and you are safe in Miami Beach. You are safe under our watch here. Thank you, Todd, and
Thank
everyone.
you.
So I could go on and on, actually, Todd. I wasn't sure how long I had to speak, but I could tell you more about how amazing your team was.
No, we really appreciated the opportunity, and I think you being at Canvases too. I think you were able to see it firsthand.
Yes.
Volunteers showing up repeatedly, being there,
Yes.
getting to know you as a candidate, and really being able to take your message to the doors.
Yes, yes, yes. And I have to say, every time people would come and go to the canvases, they were just like this huge outpouring of love and support. And it was just so humbling and flattering. And, you guys were like, you powerhouses. I was humbled by the amount of work you guys put in. And Marina girl, you're a boss. Like Marina, I have to shout out because every event she was there, every canvas, and Miles, you are also a boss, sir. And Todd, you showed up too. You guys, we really wanted to make sure we sent a message loud and clear that Miami Beach is LGBTQIA friendly and supportive, and we are a safe haven. And also, let me say too that we have had an openly gay commissioner on the dais for the past 16 years. We have Alex Fernandez. He's about to go into his second term. He got reelected. Congrats to that. And then prior to that, we had David Richardson and Michael Gongora. So we've always been represented, and it's been beautiful, and we need to remain that way. And we need to think about, when Alex Fernandez is termed out in 4 years, who's going to take over, because we always need someone who's open and out and proud on that dais.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Well,
we have
thank you
time. We have
so.
4 years, but we've got to think about it now.
Yes, well, we get to enjoy the win at least for this moment. And
Yes.
congratulations again. Many of us
Thank you.
were in the room this morning and seeing you sworn in, and
Thank
it
you.
was a
Thank you.
proud moment for
Yes.
all of us.
Thank
So
you.
we know
Yes.
your time is valuable, and you've got a lot of places you could be, and we appreciate you spending a few moments with us tonight.
Oh,
Thank you.
anytime, guys. And again, I'm going to put my phone number in the chat, my email. Reach out. I'm happy to sponsor an ordinance, sponsor a resolution. I am so supportive, you guys, and Miami Beach is supportive of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Vice Mayor, for coming on to join us this evening. And I have to say, it's incredibly, it feels really good to say Vice Mayor or Commissioner when referring to Monica in that sense, for all the hard work that we put in, all the doors that we knocked, and a lot of the folks that I see on the call, for example, who took the time to join our community panels that started by reviewing candidate qualifying paperwork, questionnaires that went through our whole endorsement process from start to finish. Really appreciate those folks for taking the time and look forward to anyone who may be on the call who's interested in being a part of that process for future elections to reach out. But for those I haven't met, I'm Miles Davis. I am SAVE's Director of Advocacy and Communications. I oversee SAVE's communications, electoral strategy, a lot of municipal engagement, and voter contact programs. So everything you're about to see is really drawn from a lot of our voter file data, a lot of turnout reports that we've been collecting for months on end, and a lot of field tracking that we have directly from on the ground experience. So it's not anecdotal, it's not retroactive storytelling, it's really how we analyze voter behavior, a lot of it in real time, and how we make strategic decisions about where to invest effort and resources. So with that, let's turn to what the data actually shows. So we'll start with voter behavior patterns that we have seen emerging. I think it's really important before we look at any single race or city to kind of slow us down and be very clear about the analytical frame that we're using to read everything that follows. I think there's a default habit in a lot of post-election analysis, especially in municipal elections, to explain outcomes almost entirely just through turnout. Maybe who showed up, who stayed home, which base performed better. I think that shorthand is familiar to folks, but it's really incomplete when we think about the broader scope. So the data across both Miami and Miami Beach really shows us that turnout alone, of course, doesn't explain a lot of the outcomes that we saw. Of course, turnout matters, but it doesn't really tell, like I said, that full story of why the voters actually made the choices that they did. So across both cities, persuasion and trust played a larger role than raw partisan registration. We saw no party affiliated voters were decisive in both electorates, but they really behaved differently because they were operating in different decision environments, not because maybe one electorate was more informed or more engaged than the other. That distinction really matters because it tells us we're not dealing with a single voter problem or a single Florida narrative, as maybe folks on a national scale like to say. We're really dealing with multiple persuasion contexts that require different strategies, and SAVE has been really successful in being able to tailor those strategies to the specific folks that we're talking to. So everything that follows should be read through that lens. So starting with Miami, I want to go around the basic facts of the December runoff because I think this is where a lot of folks' minds are right at the moment. But in the December runoff, right, we saw 37,404 voters in total participate, and turnout reached roughly 21.3% citywide. So for a December municipal election, that's a very, stable and meaningful electorate. I think the more important, though, point is that December turnout equaled 99% of November turnout. So that single fact immediately eliminates an entire category of explanations when we think about what could have or could not have happened. It wasn't a collapse of the runoff electorate. It was not a situation where one side disengaged while maybe the other remained energized. Although I think we can agree that Democrats were more energized than Republicans because we did see Republicans turn out more in the runoff. The electorate that showed up in December was essentially the same electorate that showed up in November. So that gives us a lot of confidence that what we're seeing is real voter behavior and not noise that was created by any type of drop-off, which is consistent in other types of runoff races. And because turnout held steady, we're kind of forced to focus on persuasion, right? We have to go after the folks that we need, and we can't necessarily always focus on building or registering new voters in such a short time frame. It's not necessarily a preference or a framing choice. It's just a conclusion that is supported by the facts, the short time frame, and the data that we have, and was successful in the end. So when we break that down by partisan composition, we accept that this was not, like we said, a turnout collapse story because folks were pretty engaged, especially when we look at the runoff. It becomes much more instructive than that. We know Democrats made up roughly 41.4% of ballots cast, and they outperformed their registration share by 5 percentage points, which is huge. Republicans accounted for 33.8% of the electorate, which is pretty substantial in a competitive city like Miami. And NPAs made up about 16% of voters, which could obviously make or break any type of decision when you think about their ability to sway. So in a race that's decided by 20 points, that composition tells us something immediately, right? That the margin of that size can't be explained simply by Democratic performance alone, because the math doesn't work unless two things are true simultaneously. There has to be meaningful crossover, which we saw, and NPAs have to break decisively in one direction, which we also saw. What's important here is that those were not just assumptions for us. They were the basis of our targeting strategy, and they were actually what we saw on the door, seeing as we specifically mostly targeted only NPA and soft persuasion Republican voters. From the start, SAVE didn't limit our outreach to Democratic-based universe. We deliberately focused on those persuadable NPAs and soft partisan voters, including mostly voters of color, young voters with maybe sporadic voting histories, as well as maybe some middle-aged white voters who don't necessarily reliably behave along party lines. So those universes really sat in the space where margins were made. They overlapped greatly with NPAs that included voters that were very open to persuasion, which, when you're on the doors, sometimes you'll have no conversations and sometimes you'll have conversations that go on for 15 minutes. We found we were having lots of conversations that were going on for 10 to 15 minutes because we saw that present across these precincts was a very different partisan baseline. So when we see this 19-point victory in Miami and an electorate where Democrats are just over 40% of the vote, that outcome is not surprising in retrospect because it reflects that we were talking to the voters who were actually deciding the races like this. And the data shows both the crossover and decisive NPA movement really occurred. And critically, it shows that those voters moved in places where we invested the most time, had the most contacts, and offered the most sustained engagement. And you may say, well, where was that? And I love these two maps because they show exactly where we focused our universe, and the precincts where now Mayor-elect Higgins won vindicate exactly where SAVE pulled precinct data from and the communities that actually turned out the most. You can see Coconut Grove, the Roads, Little Havana, and then obviously strong turnout in the Black communities of North Dade. We've always said a strong coast-to-coast corridor coupled with strong pairings in the Little Havana districts will always lead us to success. So on the left, you're looking at that final precinct level result of the runoff. On the right, you're looking at our universe heat map where SAVE concentrated voter contact, field time, and sustained engagement throughout the cycle. So what matters most, right, is not necessarily that the colors line up perfectly, but that the patterns do. And one area where this is especially clear is like in Coconut Grove, the Roads, Little Havana. Early in the cycle, like Todd mentioned, SAVE made a deliberate decision to invest in these communities, including endorsing early in the runoffs and putting real field time, social media, ads, everything you can imagine, voter guides, both in English and Spanish, into precincts that many campaigns had written off as immovable or already decided. And it really wasn't a conventional choice. Little Havana, for example, has long been treated as untouchable territory because of maybe entrenched political power or dynastic influence, I guess you can say, which has broken, right? So when you look at the side-by-side maps, you can see that the precincts where we concentrated that sustained engagement overlapped directly with where performance shifted in the runoff. Those are not accidental. With this shows is not that maybe one organization delivered a neighborhood, because we know this was a strong coalition effort, but that when you maybe stop treating communities as a static and actually engage them right early and consistently, movement is obviously possible, even in places that are dominated for decades by the same political machinery. And that's why these maps matter, especially side by side, because they show how this strategic investment, especially in places others ignore, can reshape the outcomes when the work is done early and seriously. And this slide is also, I feel like, one of the most important. You might hear me say that a few times, so don't quote me, because it shows us a few things, right? Republican turnout increased um, compared to November. Republicans performed relatively well in early voting. Their share of participation, it didn't collapse. But despite that increase, Mayor-elect Higgins, our coalition, our SAVE team expanded her margin in the runoff. Those two facts cannot coexist in any base-only explanation. If this were simply just a story about Republican disengagement, for example, or Democratic turnout dominance, which was a small piece of it, the margin, I think we all could agree, would have been narrowed. It wouldn't have grown. So the fact that the margin expanded, right, as Republican participation also increased, points directly to persuasion as the driver of the outcome, the peeling off of Republican voters who were coming out to the polls. So that vote method breakdown looks a little bit like this. We know that in the runoff, 43% of voters decided to cast their ballots by mail, 20% voted early, and 37 voted on election day, 37%. Vote by mail continues to be the largest share of the electorate, which is consistent with recent municipal cycles in Miami. But what matters most for us is the performance, seeing the performance consistent across all three methods, right? Seeing that Mayor-elect Higgins won vote by mail, she won most of the early vote, and she won election day outright. That consistently tells us something important. If the race had been driven maybe by mechanics or a single tactical advantage, we would expect to see some type of imbalance there. But strength in one method paired with weakness in others, for example, we just don't see that. Instead, vote method appears pretty neutral. Obviously, there's some preference, but it really just reflects how voters chose to participate, not necessarily why they chose the candidate that they did. So that really allows us to interpret the margin with real confidence, because in a stabilized turnout environment like this, the alignment across the vote methods means the result is being driven by persuasion that we feel occurred before ballots were actually cast, and not by a temporary voting behavior anomaly or by last minute decisions, or as we like to say, the voter, the undecided voter. These early decisions to get folks, these ads, these bilingual voter guides, and these early investments led folks to make these decisions before ballots were actually cast, and not have anything come later on. And that is a big piece of the puzzle. And then we talked about how NPAs were, of course, the decisive variable, as they are in many elections, both statewide and municipal. But the clearest signal of persuasion in this race just really appears when they really isolate that NPA behavior. So in the runoff, they made up that 16% margin in the electorate as a whole. So it doesn't sound that dominant on its own, but when the race is decided by nearly 20 points collectively, right? I think the NPA behavior becomes a lot more decisive very quickly, because based off precinct level analysis on our end, and some of the voter modeling that we've done, it's clear that NPAs broke obviously decisively for Higgins, and I think on the order of like 2/3 supporting her in the runoff. So that level of alignment alone explains most of the final margin. The math just doesn't simply work otherwise. A victory of this size in an electorate where Democrats comprised just over 40% of the ballots cast and Republican participation increased requires both crossover voting and that strong NPA consolidation. But what's also important is that this movement was not random or isolated. it wasn't necessarily a late swing, right? Because we saw it in November and then we saw it continue into December with higher margins. So their support tracked closely with where our engagement was sustained and where voters had repeated exposure over time, which we saw on the doors. And when NPAs move at this scale, it's really not because of a single tactic, and obviously not because of a last minute push, because that's not what we believe in at SAVE. It's because the persuasion tactics that we used succeeded well beyond the Democratic base and held consistently across the electorate from November to December. And one huge successful way that we were able to do this and reach the amount of people to help sway this election was through our Turnout Miami program. So Turnout Miami was that joint voter engagement project between Save Action PAC and Equality Florida Action PAC that launched with that one clear goal, right? To mobilize and persuade the growing block of pro-equality voters in the city of Miami on behalf of pro-equality champion Eileen Higgins. But from the start, we were explicit about who the program was built for, right? They were voters frustrated by the state and national attacks on LGBTQ freedoms and looking for strong local leadership that would actively defend our progress. So our strategy was to meet those voters early, consistently, and across multiple channels. So in total, the program targeted 13,362 pro-equality voters in the city of Miami through a coordinated multi-channel outreach effort. Most of those folks you saw situated through our heat map. That included 6 unique digital ads that generated more than 319,000 impressions, alongside 22,700 targeted emails that were all geared towards reinforcing that same core message time and time again. So field and direct voter contact were obviously central to that. Over the course of the runoff, we executed 11 days of action alone, knocked on thousands of doors, filled 44 volunteer shifts, and made just shy of 46,100 calls. So maintaining that visible and repeated engagement through December made the outcome clear to us, right? Because on Tuesday, our last Tuesday, Mayor-elect Higgins won with 22,142 votes. So I think when you take that into account, that we really, really went after those 13,000 folks, you can really see the correlation. And in an electorate where the turnout held steady from November to December and Republican participation increased, that margin reflects the persuasion layered right on top of participation. And Turnout Miami really provided the consistency that was needed for that persuasion to actually take hold. Those canvases that happen multiple times a week, those robocalls, then following up and seeing those ads, those emails, all of it geared towards that same core group of folks. And then also us really making sure to take the time that the volunteers matched the community that they were actually canvassing in. And with that being said, how can we talk about Turnout Miami without some wonderful photos? Too many to actually put on one slide, but as you know, in persuasion-heavy environments, right, voters don't experience campaigns as charts or models. They experience them as patterns, usually through people coming into their neighborhood and knocking on their door. So who shows up early? Who keeps showing up, I should say, who disappears maybe right after one canvas, one weekend, all is seen and taken note by these communities, especially communities that are historically left behind. So these photos and our broader strategy as a whole represent the groundwork that made the persuasion outcomes we just discussed possible, and the numbers don't exist without this work underneath them. And closing out Miami, really briefly, what it tells us going forward is probably not unique to a lot of other municipalities, right? Early engagement creates familiarity. Familiarity changes how later messages are received. And by the time voters are making those final decisions, they are responding to something that already feels known rather than something new. So that's something that matters beyond Miami. That's something that could probably be applied to many places, many states, many municipalities. But it tells us that even in places where partisan trends may look challenging, persuasion is still a viable strategy when we respect how voters actually make decisions and when we might run into issues where we might not be able to be in a position to expand the electorate, maybe through voter registration. And before I move on to Miami Beach, did anyone have any questions about the city of Miami? Awesome. Well, we will also be monitoring the chat. So if anything does come up, please feel free to put it in the chat. We'll have a couple other opportunities to address those as well. But Miami Beach requires a different analytical lens, right? Because it's important that we don't misinterpret the differences that these communities are experiencing because, of course, it's a smaller municipal electorate. Many voters here participate in multiple local elections time and time again and have prior exposure to these candidates' issues and city governance. And that's doesn't necessarily make this electorate better or more informed than others. It just means that the decision environment that we've noticed is different. We've noticed that familiarity accumulates across cycles and persuasion operates through maybe reinforcement rather than expansion. And understanding that distinction to us is really critical because applying a Miami style persuasion strategy here would miss how voters are actually deciding. And similar to Miami, right? Miami Beach also had historic margins that tell us something. We saw in November Miami Beach with historic turnout that led to Alex Fernandez getting the highest, I should say, Alex's win in the same cycle, right? Followed that same dynamic, receiving one of the highest vote margins ever in city history, recent city history. And it wasn't just a large margin, it was a large margin with folks that we noticed have a really stable turnout and a really repeat municipal electorate history. So they've voted time and time and time again, and very rarely have they missed an election. I didn't put this on a slide in Miami, but one thing we noticed about Miami is that they had over 2,000 voters who voted for the very, very first time. They didn't even vote in November, right? They voted for the very first time on December 9th, didn't even cast a ballot in November. We didn't see that in Miami Beach. So when I say, maybe stable turnout or repeat voter, it's just because these electorates tend to be a lot of the same folks, and we don't necessarily see a large spike of people coming out to the polls for the very first time. We also saw this pattern reinforced across the ballot because, for example, Alex's win, Laura's win, they weren't simply a base turnout story as well. Those margins were so large that we know that NPA crossover, Republican crossover, taken together, margin size, all of those things played a huge role in that. And we also saw that there was a huge fragmented electorate in November, but the consolidation in December was unlike anything we've seen before. So the November election featured a pretty crowded field, in particular with the Commission District 1 race. So that naturally produced some fragmentation. That outcome is maybe not a signal of confusion or resistance. We've talked about the Miami Beach electorate being pretty stable, being pretty a lot of the same high turnout folks who've never missed an election. So that fragmentation is pretty common when we think about the predictable result of multiple viable options in a race. So what matters most is what happened next. By December, once the choice was clear, voters consolidated rapidly. And when I say rapidly, the vice mayor consolidated a nearly 50-point swing from November to December. And like we've said in the other races, it doesn't happen by accident or through base math alone. It happens when voters who were previously split really converge based on what? Credibility, familiarity, and that perceived fit for governance. which was our core message at the door. A two-time chief of staff who's ready to hit the ground running on day one, unlike her opponent who has no experience in city governance. Resonated incredibly well, especially when you factor in all of the other amazing things about her record. And similar to the other elections, we have some very amazing maps. The large map, of course, reflects Monica, the vice mayor's runoff win, and it's worth pausing right on look at that sweep. Every precinct in Miami Beach, except for the city's two most conservative precincts. And when we think about that electorate where the folks are a lot of the same high informed repeat folks, that level of district-wide performance is a significant feat. So you can see this clearly in areas like Normandy, which shows up here in light blue. That's not incidental, right? We spent a substantial amount of time in Normandy because we understood both how competitive it is and what was at stake in this election. The results reflect that sustained place-based engagement rather than a late surge or isolated turnout effect. So the three smaller maps to the right show the mayoral race where Kristen ultimately lost by a fewer than 400 votes alongside Alex Fernandez and Laura Dominguez's race. But what matters here is not that every contest produced the same outcome, but that the spatial patterns, right, are consistent across races. So across all of these, we see voters moving mostly in the same direction across most of the district. Even where margins were extremely tight, alignment was pretty broad rather than concentrated in a few base precincts. And that really tells us that we're not looking at random shifts or one-off wins or an influx of people who didn't vote in one election all of a sudden showing up. We're seeing consolidation once voters reach clarity. And it's also worth noting that in Miami Beach, right, the consolidation included a lot of key audiences that we're also targeting, right? Those older voters and higher propensity repeat municipal election voters who you've heard me mention time and time again, who make up the base of Miami Beach, who don't maybe always align with a pro-equality campaign, right? Who respond strongly, maybe more to credibility, consistency, or governance-focused messaging when they are met where they are. So we tailored our messaging to such. We changed literature to meet certain communities where they were. So that meant, engaging them on those local issues, neighborhood quality of life concerns, and that visible follow-through rather than those partisan labels or that national framing. And then, of course, like Todd said, showing up early, returning consistently, and treating the voters as the decision makers and not as the afterthought or as the commodity. And Marina will tell you, it got to the point where we would roll up into some people's driveway to knock on their door, and they would recognize us. They even almost on a first name basis, but they'd be like, "Oh, I know you guys. You guys are saved. Yes, I just returned my vote by mail ballot." And they're not upset, that we were just there or that we were there a little while ago. It's almost like a sense of relief. It's like, well, they actually did come back. So those types of interactions truly do make a difference. And when we think about what drove that consolidation, it's really voters making decisions based off of, like I said, that strong governance, that credibility, that local impact, rather than that partisan cue alone. You heard me say the two-time chief of staff who's ready to hit the ground running on day one, unlike her opponent who has no experience in municipal governance whatsoever. There's nothing partisan in that whatsoever. And when I say folks loved that type of message on the door, as a former aide, right, as someone who worked in both branches of the legislature, able to actually speak to that, right, the power of someone who's worked in municipal government being able to lead on day one goes a long way. That reinforcement of what we saw, that persuasion operating across lines, even though just the decision environment was different, made a really big difference. And when we think about how our strategy matched the beach and how those folks decide, it was intentionality designed to just meet the moment. Rather than focusing on volume or late stage saturation, we really just emphasize that consistency, that familiarity, and just that governance framing was our huge hammer, I guess you can say. And then we focused a lot on repeat voters, so folks who have a strong history of showing up in municipal elections, unlike Miami, right, where we branched out a little bit to focus on those sporadic voters, NPAs, and then those soft partisans reinforcing that presence rather than chasing the expansion, like we saw in Miami, where there was 2,000 people who came out for the first time in December. So this approach really reduced that volatility of Miami that we saw and allowed the consolidation to happen very quickly once the field narrowed. And it wouldn't be complete without some photos from Miami Beach. You can even see complete with the rainstorm. We never stop. But these images just really capture the consistency, what it actually looks like, right? The same people showing up repeatedly, the same neighborhoods over an extended period of time, because it matters. And the photos represent the infrastructure that allows the strategy to actually function. So without this level of consistency, none of the persuasion outcomes that we've been discussing throughout the entire call would be repeatable or would be possible. And that's honestly the difference between a one-off win and a model that we can scale to the future. And to close out Miami Beach on what it teaches us, it's quite similar to Miami, right? When we engage voters months before anyone else did, and when we invest early and consistently in our candidates, we can be successful. This was not about any type of last minute turnout tactics or election day mechanics. It was really about sustained presence, message discipline, and giving candidates the support that they need to earn trust over time. It was about taking the time to take SAVE's entire 70,000 plus membership and match it to the voter file so that we know who of our membership in Miami Beach has a ballot and we can reach out to them one-on-one. So that's one less thing the Democratic Club or the candidate has to do. You know, in low turnout municipal elections where the same voters participate cycle after cycle, early engagement and that candidate investment compound together, and there's just not enough time in the day. So being able to take these strategies and work on what one core group of folks can do versus the other goes a long way. And the takeaway, like I said, was just very clear. That campaigns that start first and invest in their candidates have the opportunity and will shape the electorate. And they're far harder to dislodge or push off to the side than the campaigns that start a little bit later. So similar to Miami, that lesson is transferable, I feel like, to other municipalities across the state with other similar turnout patterns. And it's really amazing because this all connects to what SAVE has called our path to victory. Um, it's really critical, right, to understand that the municipal outcomes we've talked and walked through tonight are not isolated. They're really the first visible layer of our much larger strategy because they don't exist on their own. Every one of these cities sits inside of a legislative and congressional district. They're the same voters who are going to decide other maybe commission races, school board seats, legislative primaries, and statewide races that are coming up in 2026. So what municipal elections gives us is something incredibly powerful. It's that early trust building in a low noise environment where there's not too much to compete with. And when we can lay these building blocks early, when voters are paying closer attention to local governance, they are evaluating credibility a little bit differently, and they're forming opinions about which organizations and messengers feel grounded and serious. That matters. And when SAVE shows up early in these municipal races, you know, we're not just trying to win that election. We're really shaping who voters recognize, who they listen to, and who they trust when the ballot gets longer and when stakes get higher. So that will compound over time. And when a voter who has seen SAVE consistently in their neighborhood, who associates us with competent local leadership, who watched our endorsements align with outcomes that were far more likely to view us as credible messengers. And when we engage them around other issues, right? School board, legislative, statewide policy fights, our credibility will go that much farther. So um, that's what we mean when we say our path to victory. It's not a single jump, right, from City Hall to the state capitol, which Marina will talk about a little bit later. But it is an accumulation of credibility built election by election. And you'll hear Todd say this, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city, block by block, issue by issue. So the data that you've seen from tonight shows how that accumulation is working in practice, these early engagements that are leading to persuasion, and then that leading to consolidation, and then that consolidation building the margins, and then those margins sitting inside larger districts that ultimately determine these statewide outcomes or the outcome in the next race. So what you've seen tonight is not just how SAVE wins municipal races or works to win municipal races. It's how we intentionally build durable power that carries forward into 2026 and beyond, and how it's possible to scale upward. And before we talk about what comes next, I would love to kick it over to Marina.
Hello. Thank you so much, Miles. Yeah, so before we talk about what's next, I want to briefly introduce myself if you don't already know who I am. My name is Marina Breenan, and I'm SAVE's Advocacy and Outreach Manager. My role sits at the intersection of field execution, community engagement, and leadership development for the next generation. Everything you've heard about sustained presence, turnout tracking, canvassing, and real-time adjustments depends on our field program infrastructure. Our success was due to starting field actions as early as possible, as Miles has said, and it depended on our volunteers and field team being trained, supported, and coordinated over time. And I'd also like to add that in the Miami Beach runoff, we had more than a dozen days of action leading up to Election Day. We couldn't have done that without loyal SAVE volunteers wanting to stay involved throughout the cycle. The outcomes you've seen tonight were not only the result of good strategy, they're a result of capacity built deliberately and maintained throughout the entire election cycle. That's what my work focuses on, and that's why the next slides matter. A central part of how SAFE sustains this work is through our internship and leadership development programs. Our SAFE interns, they're not just observers in election cycles. They directly support our canvassing, phone banks. They helped us with turnout tracking and real-time data analysis during both November and December. Their work allowed staff to stay focused on strategy while maintaining a strong on-the-ground presence through the end of the cycle. This matters because it's not just about winning elections, as we've been saying. It's about building a pipeline of people who understand how to do this work effectively and ethically. The wins you saw tonight were strengthened by that pipeline. That leadership pipeline also carries directly into legislative session. In 2026, Save will be traveling to Tallahassee again for lobby days, where the relationships we've built with elected officials and our year-long advocacy experience translates into policy impact. This is where local credibility and having SAVE staff who have legislative experience becomes tangible leverage. Community members who engage voters locally are the same people meeting with lawmakers, sharing their lived experiences, and shaping policy outcomes in Tallahassee. This continuity, training residents on how to attend local city and county commission meetings, and then having them come up to Tallahassee to lobby their own state legislators is intentional. It's how SAVE ensures that electoral wins don't end on election day, but move directly into sustained advocacy for years to come. We're also pleased to officially roll out our self-service voter registration kiosk in the beginning of 2026. We just had our pilot program this year and it's been going great. And now that we have comprehensive voter data, we plan to set up extensive voter registration programs throughout areas in South Florida that had low voter registration and low voter turnout. So we're very excited. And with that, I will hand it back to Todd to close this out.
Well, thank you, Marina, and thank you, Miles, both of you, for such meaningful insights. I'm so grateful for the work that each of you have done this year. I'm very proud. As we close, I want to bring it back to the core takeaway. So what we have seen is not a collection of isolated wins. It's a demonstration of how power is built deliberately, locally, and over time. And when strategy matches context, when engagement starts early, and when organizations invest in people, outcomes follow and they can be repeated. That's the model that SAVE is committed to carrying forward into 2026 and beyond. And it's a demonstration of SAVE's unique role in South Florida as a convener of the community, as a repository of pro-equality advocacy and electoral expertise. So thank you for taking the time for joining us tonight and for engaging so deeply with this work. We're grateful for your partnership, and we look forward to continuing this work together. Before we end, we want to make sure if there are any other questions. So think if you've got a question. But we do have another special guest here. Surfside Commissioner is here. Jerry, do you want to jump on and we've got another election coming up very quickly here. You want to share about that real quick?
We do. I just want to introduce myself quickly. I'm Gerardo Valdastegui. I'm a commissioner in the town of Surfside. I was honored to be endorsed by SAVE in my first election in 2024. And in Surfside, we elect everybody all the time. So we have another municipal election coming up in March of 2026. We're a small town, but we do have a long tradition as well of LGBT representation on our commission. I'm currently one of two LGBT commissioners, along with our Vice Mayor Tina Paul, another SAVE endorsee. And I believe we'll both be running. Our qualifying period starts in January. And I just want to, say to those of you on the call, this has been a fantastic couple of months, for SAVE and for all of us in South Florida. And I hope the momentum continues straight through 2026. There are lots of municipal elections in lots of small municipalities between now and the August primaries. We are one of them, but I hope that, we welcome any help in this election coming up. We're right at the geographic center of one of those state house districts that
Mhm.
Todd mentioned earlier. And yeah, I think I hope that this wonderful machinery and all this momentum can just keep on going through 2026.
Thanks, Commissioner. Anyone else have any closing thoughts, comments, questions?
Todd, there's also a question from Gloria in the chat that I think Miles could answer. Miles, you're on mute.
The mute button strikes again. Gloria put in the chat, thank you for illustrating the importance of long-term strategy using the nested district connections. Is SAFE working with other allies across the state to apply the same approach with an eye towards flipping the House in time for the 2032 redistricting process? The short answer is yes. Not in this deck were some other partners that were also doing incredible work in the city of Miami. For example, we're working with Gen Clio Action, Engage Miami, Florida Rising, 32BJ, which is SEIU, Poder Latinx. There's a whole host of other orgs, I think Equal Ground, all of which sit in the same broader coalition, where we all compare data. So all the same data and heat maps, for example, that we share here, we also share with all of those same coalition partners. And I know for a fact that as of, for example, the 8th of December, Engage Miami, Florida Rising, and 32BJ knocked 16,000 doors since October 1st and almost 27,000 phone calls since December 8th. So we are working closely with other orgs, and we have tried to be a model to a lot of other orgs since we were the first one out of all those ones listed that were on the doors for this particular municipal election cycle. So our hope is to, let other folks know that it's important to get out early, but then two, it's important on who you are actually talking to and the message that you have when you're actually talking to them.
Fantastic. Anyone else? Well, if not, thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us this evening, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.